there is a high chance that the famous valkyrjur, the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain carrying them to Odin's hall, would have initially been a much more terrifying appearance, and afterwards they became romanticized and even the objects of sexual desire. And we have a couple of indications in Old Norse texts suggesting this possibility. For example, in the Volsunga saga, valkyrjur are referred to as being so terrifying as if you were staring into the fire or staring into a flame. And perhaps the most compelling example comes from a poem which is interpolated in the saga of Brennunjol. It is a poem called the Darðarljóð, the Song of the Spear, where a man is observing some women who are operating a web, a loom, a vertical loom, but this turns out as functioning with the body parts of the dead soldiers. The poem is presented as concerning the Battle of Clontarf outside Dublin in 1014, although there is a chance that it actually might have referred to a battle having taken place in the early 10th century. At any rate, the description is absolutely fascinating. So we find these women who are trying to set up the vertical loom, and then when the warp is set up, blood starts raining down, and then it is described what they're actually using in order to make this loom functional. The fabric is warped with men's entrails, it is weighted with men's heads, the spears serve as heddle rods, and arrows are pin beaters, and with their swords they must beat the fabric of victory. So a pretty convincing image regarding this relationship between valkyrjur and war, this relationship which becomes very noticeable if you look at a couple of names, of valkyrjur names. Also the link to Odin becomes obvious. The names usually refer to devastation, to violence, to destruction, generally speaking to battle and war. And you also have a couple of examples referring to charms and sorcery, but they're definitely rarer than the ones referring to battles. So to visualize this whole idea, let me give you a couple of examples. You're going to find a very comprehensive list if you read Neil Price's book, Mind and Magic in Iron Age Scandinavia. So we have Brynhildr, who is perhaps the most well-known, or at least one of the most well-known cases. Her name would mean something like a bright armor or a bright battle, and you can find her not only in the Volsunga saga, the famous Fornaldra saga, the legendary saga describing the deeds of Sigurd, the dragon slayer. You can also find her in a couple of poems, heroic poems from the collection of Norse poetry, the Poetic Edda, but this material is actually the basis for the prose tale. And she is the one who actually teaches Sigurd a lot about how to use runes to perform magic. Other names involve the spear, for example, Geirskogul, the spear shaker, or Geirdrivul, the spear flinger. Geiravor, the spear goddess, so anything with Geir in front of the word. So this connection to Odin is becoming more clear because the spear of Odin, so Gungnir, is something that perhaps is referred to here. But at any rate, it carries this connotation, this link to Odinic powers. Then we have Gunnar, who is one of the most named valkyrjur in all of the sources. You can find her in a lot of skaldic poetry. You can also find her in Eddic poetry, for example in Helgakviða, Hundingsbana, in Völuspor, in the aforementioned Darðarljóð, and like I said, in a lot of skaldic poetry, and her name would simply mean war or battle. Gondul is very well known as well. She can mean something like the staff wielder. She also seems to appear in some kenning, some metaphors regarding wolves, so that would also be a connection to war. You can also find her in poems such as Völuspá, the Daradajóð again, and lists of valkyrjur, heiti valkyrja, or ósinja, heiti. These would be lists with Nordic goddesses, and of course also in skaldic poetry, for example in Håkonarmál, and some other examples as well. Herfjótur, it would mean the war fetter. Herja, that would be the devastator. Hildur, that's also a very well-known valkyrja from poetry. You can find her in Völuspá, again in Grímnismál, in Daradajóð, again in these lists of valkyrjur and goddesses, and several lausavísa, so again skaldic poetry. Hjörþrimul, the sword noise. Hlokk, that would mean noise or chain. This is also an interesting case. You can also find her in these lists. And she seems to have had some kind of magical connotation as well. Then we have Hrist, that would be the shaker, or mist, that would be cloud. Kora, probably meaning curl, but that's just in a section of prose. Many of these examples we unfortunately find only in one source, so the ones we find in more than one source would be, for example, Hildur or Hlokk or Gondul, but most of them we just find either on a list or in one source. Other examples include Randgrímr, that would be a shield violence, or Radgríður, that would be the scraper of shields. Then we have Sigurdrífa, the victory bringer. This is actually most likely the equivalent of Brynhildr in the poetry sources. In Sigurdrífumál, for example, we find her name in the prose section, but then we also find her in another poem about the slaying of the dragon Fáfnismál. Sigrun, the victory rune. Skalmold, that would be the sword time. Skuld, we also find her as one of the Norns, one of the fates, the entities deciding the fates of mankind and residing at the roots of Yggdrasil. That's a sign for the fact that the supernatural beings were not always that well differentiated among each other. We have Valkyrjur, but we also have Dísir, and we also have Nornir, and they would have been kind of mixed in the minds of the people from the 10th, 11th century. We have Skogul, that would be the shaker or simply the battle. Skogul is also a character we find very often in Völuspá, in Hotatal, in Grímnismál, again in these lists of goddesses and valkyrjur, and a couple of poems. Svava, this is the character we find in Helgakvíða Hjörvarðssonar, and again as a reincarnated version in Helgakvíða Hundingsbana as Sigrun. So this is also something that can happen to Valkyrjur. They can be reincarnated according to some sources at least. Other names include Svipul, the changeable, Thrima, fight, Thrúður, power, or All rune, the ale rune. This would also be with some kind of magical connotation. We have the Alu runes, for example, which seems to have been in some kind of sorceress context, perhaps related to the idea of ecstasy and shamanism. So these names are very telling. They tell us that Valkyrjur were in some sense embodiments of Odin's abilities, of Odin's power, and we recognize them as, for example, inducing confusion or making you freeze on the battlefield or clouding your mind so that then you can be carried without too much of protest, carried to Odin and be used in his army of Einherjar to fight at the end of the world at Ragnarok. These connotations related to sorcery, I also find them interesting because one of the names, Gondul, suggests a reference to the use of staffs in perhaps shamanic rituals, perhaps conjuring combative helping spirits. This might be an explanation. Other names would be harder to interpret. They might have something to do with ecstasy, but we can't really tell for sure, such as this last name I mentioned, the Olrun. But in any case, you can definitely notice from these examples the very close connection to Odin and to this whole idea of battle, and I might even call it war propaganda, because you can also find valkyrjur, or what we believe to be valkyrjur, represented in some artistic sources. You can find them with horns being offered to the warriors when they enter Valhalla. So there was also some kind of waitresses for the warriors for the Einherjar, and this is also supported by something Snorri Sturluson says. So it would have definitely functioned as a reasoning, as a way to convince warriors to go into battle and to be fearless, because at the end of the journey they would have these women as their companions. But to come back at the beginning of this small presentation, there is a high chance that the valkyrjur were actually extremely terrifying at the beginning, and with the passage of time, mythology, poetry, and so on and so forth was conceived in such way as to make them more pleasant and more desirable, as the names also suggest, kind of like a metaphor for war, but trying to make war a little more acceptable. So if you look at these names again, you are going to, I think, find a little better reflected this whole idea of them having this very particular violent and destructive nature. Alright, if you enjoyed this, I would like to invite you to my presentation on women in the Viking Age. It will include not only the valkyrjur, but also other images of women in the very interesting Viking Age, as well as in saga literature, and you will find out more about other types of women, for example, about the sorceresses, prophetesses, or wetters. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the subscribe button so that I might produce more content on similar topics.